Hey, how's it going? You caught me setting up my phone because I accidentally hit the record button while I was setting it up, but that's okay. Here we are. So today we're going to talk about the moral argument. And in fact, as I was thinking about this a while ago, at first I thought, well, I can do all this in one video. And then I thought, no, I should do one premise in one video, another premise in another video. And then I started thinking, well, I should probably also answer objections. So maybe I'll make 3 videos out of it. In reality, I could probably make a book out of this one argument, because it's probably, of all the theistic arguments, this is the one I've thought about the most, and it's the one I've written about the most, and really it's the one I find the most persuasive. I mentioned in the earlier ones, other than the fine-tuning argument, with the cosmological arguments, I'm not certain that those lead to a personal creator, and they lead to some kind of creating something, being, but the arguments for that being a person that William Lane Craig gives are not that persuasive. I mean, they're kind of understandable, but they're not that persuasive. And in the case of the fine-tuning argument, that one does lead to a person, because you have to have a person if you're going to engineer something. But that argument to me is not quite as strong as the cosmological arguments. It does have some strength, and like I said, it's becoming stronger. But this moral argument to me is the strongest argument, and it gives you a personal being, something closer to the Christian God, something that imposes moral obligations on people and judges people and stuff like that. So okay, without further ado, since this is an argument that I've thought so much about, I made myself kind of an outline, a 2-page outline on a bigger piece of paper than I usually do, because I don't want to leave stuff out. I am going to leave a lot of stuff out just because, like I said, I could write a book about this subject, but there are some things that I want to make sure that I don't miss in here. So let's start off by defining morality. Morality is anything that can be right, wrong, good, evil, virtue and vice, rights, the idea that people have rights that can be denied or allowed or something like that. All that falls under the category of morality. So morality includes things like imperatives, like you ought to behave in such and such way, you ought not behave in other ways. There are values associated with morality, like, if somebody is suffering, that's a real tragedy. Especially if they're suffering for no good reason. Whereas if somebody is prospering, that's a good thing. Or if somebody is doing well, or somebody's kind, that's a good thing. So there are values associated with morality. There's good and evil, virtue and vice, etc. That's all falls under the category of morality. Broadly speaking, there are a lot of different moral theories out there, and each of these moral theories is trying to answer different questions. So they're not necessarily competing with each other. What I'm going to be talking about specifically is the issue of moral ontology, the beingness of morality, what exactly is morality, and stuff like that. And broadly speaking, there are 2 views. There's moral realism on the one hand, which is what I'm going to defend, and there's moral non-realism on the other hand. Now, under moral non-realism, you have all kinds of views. You've got nihilism, you've got individual subjectivism, you've got cultural relativism. So there are all kinds of views. And then in moral realism, this is just the idea that this is sometimes called moral objectivism. I guess maybe you could consider moral objectivism to be a kind of moral realism. It's basically the idea that morality doesn't just exist in your head. It's not a subjective thing. It's something that's true independently of your belief about it. So, for example, take the statement, carrots are vegetables. That's an objective statement, because whether it's true or not depends on the condition of whether it's true or not depends on whether it corresponds to the way the carrot actually is. Is it really a vegetable or not? It has nothing to do with whether you believe it or not, whether you like vegetables or carrots or whatever. But the statement, carrots are vegetables, or no, sorry, I already used that one. But the statement, carrots taste good, that's a subjective statement, because what makes that statement true is not something specifically about the carrot, but it's something about you. It has to do with your preferences for carrots. So the statement that carrots taste good could be true for you, and they could be false for somebody else. If one person said it's true and the other person said it's false, they could both be correct, because it's just a matter of subjective preference. And in the case of objective statements, an objective statement is not the same thing as a true statement. A statement can be objective and still be false. For example, if I said the earth is flat, that's an objective statement because it's not about my feelings or preferences or beliefs or anything like that. I'm making a statement about the earth itself. And if I say it's flat and it's not flat, well, then that's a false statement. But it's objective because what makes it true or false is the actual shape of the earth. So in the same way, just about everybody makes moral claims. Everybody makes moral statements. Even moral nihilists in unguarded moments will make moral statements. But the question comes down to, what do they mean by those moral statements? For example, when somebody says rape is wrong, are they talking about their personal feelings towards rape? Or are they talking about what their culture has decided or what their culture collectively believes? Or are they talking about the act of rape itself? Now, if you're talking about the act of rape itself, then you're a moral objectivist. But if you're just talking about your attitude towards rape, your dislike of rape, then you're a moral subjectivist. So the first step in my argument is to argue that in spite of what we say, we all perceive morality as if it were objective. And I have several reasons for thinking this. The first reason is because we all judge other people's. Now, being a moral subjectivist doesn't mean that you can't make moral judgments. The taste of pizza or pizza preference is a subjective thing, but we still make judgments about pizza. I judge that pineapple is great on pizza. That's my judgment. So it's not inconsistent to make judgments about people and be a moral non-realist. But what shows, I think, that people really perceive morality as if it's real is the nature of those judgments. When you treat somebody as if they had some obligation and they failed to meet that obligation, then you're treating them as if this obligation is a real thing. This obligation doesn't just exist in your head. It's not just your subjective preference. If it were your subjective preference, it wouldn't apply to other people. So when you act as if other people should have done something a different way or should not have done some other thing, then you're behaving as if morality were objective. Another reason is that we all make excuses and we all justify our behavior. When somebody accuses you of wrongdoing, your reaction is hardly ever to say, morality's just in your head. What are you talking about? What do you, leave me alone? That's your view. Usually we try to justify ourselves. Sure, lying is wrong, but I had a good reason in this case. If I hadn't lied, somebody might have gotten hurt, something like that. So we all make reasons and give justifications. And the fact that we give reasons and justifications shows that there actually is such a thing as moral justification. And that indicates a belief or just a recognition or a seeing of objective morality. Or we're seeing morality as if it were objective because we're treating it that way. Another one is that moral decision making is sometimes difficult. Now, of course, if you're trying to decide whether between vanilla Coke and Dr. Pepper, sure, you can struggle. Which one do I want? But you realize it doesn't really matter in the end. You can flip a coin if you want. You like both of them. So you don't anguish over that in the same way that you anguish over getting your moral decisions right. Sometimes moral decision making is difficult, and what makes it difficult is that it's sometimes hard to find the correct answer. But that presupposes that there is a correct answer. And the difficulty is in finding what that correct answer is. Another one is that moral non-realists are rarely ever consistent. That can be consistent when you're in the middle of a debate or something, but at unguarded moments, they almost always betray a belief in objective morality. When I first heard about this, I read about it in Greg Koukl and Francis Beckwith's book, Relativism, Feet Firmly Planted in Midair. They mentioned this. And they were talking about it specifically in the case of tolerance. Like somebody would say, everybody decides morality for themselves, therefore you shouldn't judge me or you shouldn't judge other people. And when they said you shouldn't judge other people, they were betraying the fact that they believed that there was this objective moral imperative not to judge other people. So they were kind of being inconsistent. I don't hear people saying stuff like that as much now as they said like 20 years ago. And so, but over the last 20 years, I have noticed in a lot of my discussions with people in my debates that it's true. I mean, experience has taught this to me. People are inconsistent. And like I said before, it's not necessarily inconsistent just to have moral opinions or moral points of view and stuff like that. What's inconsistent is the things that they say. For example, I read this book, Conversations with God by Neil Donald Walsh. And in this book, God is telling Neil Donald Walsh that there's no such thing as right and wrong, and he's never made any, or she has never made any rules or anything like that. But then she kept going back on that. It's inappropriate to do this, and it's wrong to do this, and just, there was inconsistencies throughout the book. And I cataloged all these inconsistencies on my blog, and maybe I'll post a link to it. I had another debate with, well, it wasn't a formal debate. It was a conversation with a guy online, and he was pretty adamant that there were no objective moral points of view. And after having a conversation with him for a while, I went and looked at his blog, and just fairly recently, not recent now, but recently relative to when we were having this discussion, he had talked about how he changed his mind on some moral point of view. I don't remember what the point of view was, but he was going on and on about how wrong he was in the past. Well, if there's no objective morality, he couldn't have been wrong in the past. He was just different. He had a moral point of view at one point. He changed his moral point of view. He wasn't wrong in either case. Neither point of view is better than the other. Neither is right, neither is wrong. He just simply changed his moral preference and stuff. So the fact that he, went on and on about how wrong he was and how he'd been mistaken, that shows that he believes in objective morality. I did have a formal debate with a girl on a forum one time, and I went back and looked at her history and stuff, and because I was curious, if she was going to be consistent with the point of view that she was defending. She was defending cultural relativism, and so I went back and she made some comment about how messed up culture is, or how messed up our culture is, which is obviously inconsistent with the claim that culture defines what morality is. As a cultural relativist, you have to believe that what makes something right or wrong is the collective point of view of your culture. So to stand outside of culture and criticize your own culture's moral point of view is to assume that there's an objective standard that stands outside of your culture's point of view. So she was inconsistent. It's extremely rare that I ever run into a moral relativist who, after a while, will not be inconsistent with their moral relativism or their subjectivism. And so I think this betrays the fact that in spite of what people say, everybody at least perceives morality as if it were objective. Another thing, and this is a big one, is that I think for anybody who is not a sociopath, moral non-realism is going to come across as being wildly counterintuitive. And there are several points here that I wrote down about how it comes across as being counterintuitive. One thing, if moral non-realism is true, then no culture is better or worse than any other culture. A slave culture is no better or worse than a free culture. A culture that takes care of its people is no better than one that's cruel to its people. Another one is that obviously, there's no such thing as moral improvement. You can change your moral point of view, and a culture can change its moral point of view, but it can't really improve. The only way you can improve is if there's some objective standard that stands, above and beyond the individual or the culture. There are such a thing as moral reformers. These are people who come into a culture that adopts a point of view and criticizes that culture, and then eventually everybody changes their mind, and these people are usually considered moral heroes. People like William Wilberforce, who opposed the slave trade, and there were other abolitionists. They all went against their culture, but we consider them moral heroes. They had some kind of enlightened point of view. Jesus is often considered a moral hero. Martin Luther King Jr., he went against his culture's beliefs, and these people are considered moral reformers. But if you adopt moral relativism, then by definition, these people were actually immoral because they were going against their culturally defined set of moral principles. But that's counterintuitive. I mean, we all think these people are great. Anybody that comes along and makes us better people is a hero. If there's no objective right and wrong, then you can't really accept praise and blame. Maybe in some sense you can. I guess you can accept praise and blame, but it doesn't really have any objective meaning because you're not really virtuous or vicious. If there's no objectively true answers to moral questions, then it doesn't make sense to debate moral issues. Having a debate on a moral issue would be like arguing over whether pineapple belongs on pizza. I mean, there are these debates that go on online, but they're mostly silly. We don't take them seriously. If you do take them seriously, I don't know. But anyway, moral debate is meaningful as long as there's a correct answer to a moral question, because then you can debate and see who's right or wrong or whatever. Also, another one, this is another big one, is just when you consider there are some things that are clear case examples of objective morals. For example, just torturing somebody for the fun of it. That's just an obvious moral wrong. And the suggestion that there's absolutely nothing wrong with it, that it makes no difference whether you're kind to somebody or whether you torture them to death, that's wildly counterintuitive. And I think even if you're a moral subjectivist, you're going to consider that counterintuitive. Now, of course, even if you're a moral subjectivist, I'm not suggesting that moral subjectivists don't have a moral point of view, as I've said many times before. You can be a moral subjectivist and be consistent in not liking it when people are tortured and rather they didn't get tortured. What I'm claiming is counterintuitive is the idea that there is objectively nothing wrong with it. That's counterintuitive. And the same thing with, you can come up with all kinds of things, the Holocaust, all kinds of horrible things that have happened in history. And that brings me to my next point, which is the problem of evil. When people raise the problem of evil against the existence of God, they're saying, well, there's a good God who's all powerful and all knowing, but all these horrible things happen in the world. And God either allows these things to happen, or in some cases in the Bible, he causes them to happen. And so, but these things are obviously evil, and a good God wouldn't allow evil to happen. And so the fact that evil happens shows that either God's not good, or God doesn't exist, or God's not all powerful, or something. There's something awry. This argument has a lot of weight, whether you're a Christian or an atheist. This argument should have a lot of weight. And the reason it has weight is because obviously there is such a thing as good and evil. In the objective sense, if it was all just a matter of preference, this argument against God would make no sense. Because what are you objecting to? You just have a different preference than God? Your preferences have no bearing whatsoever on whether God exists or whether God is good or evil. The argument only makes sense if there really are objective cases of evil in the world. I'm going to make a separate video where I answer the argument from the problem of evil. There are some people that raise the problem of evil in a way that's not inconsistent with moral non-realism. They'll say that it's an internal contradiction in Christianity because Christians affirm both a good God and the existence of evil. They are affirming a contradiction. And so you can make that argument without presupposing objective morality. But the fact of the matter is that's not usually the way people raise the problem of evil. The fact of the matter is when people raise the problem of evil, they're almost always assuming that there's real evil in the world. And I have one more argument, and these arguments, just to remind you, are all supposed to be showing how counterintuitive it is to deny objective morality. The final one is how people object to the divine command theory. The divine command theory is the idea that what makes something right or wrong is that God commands it, or forbids it, or allows it, or something like that. And so the argument people often raise is that point of view leads to absurdity. And the absurdity it leads to is that if something can be wrong or right just based on whether God allows it or forbids it, well, God could allow or forbid anything. He could allow you to rape children. He could forbid saving people's lives. There's just all kinds of crazy things God could do. Well, notice that this objection gets its force from the idea that it's inconceivable that it could ever be morally okay to rape children, or morally wrong to be kind to people, or something like that. So a person who raises this objection is making a very strong claim. They're making the claim not only that morality is objective, but in fact that it's necessary, because they cannot even conceive of any possible world in which certain things are right or certain things are wrong. And so anybody that raises this objection obviously has a very strong moral intuition about moral realism. Okay, so that's it for those arguments. Now, I think I've established that everybody, whether they affirm the reality of moral precepts or not, you should at least acknowledge that everybody perceives morality as if it were real. That's what all these arguments were supposed to have shown. That's a lot of apologists, that they just stop right there. So over the years, I've kind of developed an argument to take this a step farther, because after all, it's possible to believe things and to be completely wrong about it, you know? And so, so the next step in my argument is going to show that our belief and our natural innate belief in objective morality is a rational position to hold. In fact, it's more rational to affirm it than to deny it. And let me first say that I don't think, strictly speaking, you can prove morality in the same way you can prove that the sun is out there in space, or that the Earth orbits the sun, or anything like that. What I'm arguing is that it's more rational to affirm than to deny. And I'm going to use an analogy to show it. What I'm going to show, as I explained in my whole series on epistemology, everything that we know can be kind of reduced down to a priori items of knowledge that we have that's not inferred from something else. The knowledge is intuitive. It's kind of innate. And there's three kinds of knowledge. One of them is just knowledge of our own mental perception, or our own mental happenings, things that happen in our minds. Like I can think of a number and know what number I'm thinking of. I can have a sensation and know what sensation I'm having. I know that I'm perceiving what appears to be an external world. So it's just knowledge of my own mind. And I can close my eye. I mean, we have this knowledge just through introspection. It's not something that has to be proved, because we have direct, immediate access to it. And then there's a second category, which is knowledge of necessary truths, and that includes math, geometry, and logic. And then there's a third category that consists of synthetic a priori knowledge, and these are items of knowledge that are not necessary truths, and so they cannot be proved, and but they're all just kind of hardwired into us. And these include things like our knowledge that our senses are giving us true information about an external world, our knowledge that our memories are giving us true information about a past that actually happened, the uniformity of nature. I have a whole list of them. I wrote a whole list of them somewhere. Memory, the idea that we are enduring selves, that we are a self that endures through time and change. Object permanence, ought implies can, causation, other minds. Intentional action. There's a whole list of them. But to make this analogy, just to make this argument simple, I'm just going to use a couple of them. I'm going to use the one that tells us that the external world is real, and this one is just the only way we know about the external world is through our sensory perceptions. And so it's the idea that our sensory perceptions are giving us true information about a real external world. Without that one, I mean, just admit you don't know much of anything. You don't even know that the Holocaust happened. You could be a consistent Holocaust denier and nobody could make fun of you, because you could say, well, the external world doesn't exist, therefore nothing that I've ever read was real, nothing I've ever seen on TV was real. There were no concentration camps because the external world doesn't exist. So anybody that claims that they believe in the Holocaust is affirming the existence of the external world. So I'm going to use that one, and I'm going to use the uniformity of nature. Now, this is the idea that the future will resemble the past. So if we notice certain patterns in nature in the past, and we've come up with a law, then we have reason to believe that that law is going to hold tomorrow. So if gravity has worked a certain way in the past, gravity is going to keep working that way tomorrow. If fire has been hot in the past, it's going to keep being hot tomorrow. So this principle is how we learn anything from experience. You know, it's how science works. But it can't be proved because to prove it, you'd have to say something like, well, we've been using this principle in the past, and look how much scientific information it's given us. I mean, science has been wildly successful in giving us true information about the world. Sure, but does that mean it's going to continue to work tomorrow? See, the argument is circular because it assumes the very thing it's trying to establish, which is that past experience can tell us something about what we should accept in the future. The fact that the principle itself has worked in the past doesn't tell us that it's going to continue to work in the future unless we assume the principle is true and that the future will resemble the past. So there are certain criteria that all the members of this third category fit. And one of them is, like I said, they can't be proved. And the other is that none of the items of knowledge are necessary truths. It is at least possible that everything will change tomorrow. All the laws of nature will be rewritten and everything will be different. That's at least possible. It's also possible, strictly speaking, that the external world is an illusion. It's possible that we're just minds, that idealism is true. I dealt with idealism in a prior video. So those things are possible. And so the same thing is true of morality. Morality cannot be proved, and they do not express necessary truths. So a third category is that we sometimes make mistakes when applying them. So consider the external world. Our senses do sometimes deceive us. We have dreams that are entirely in our heads. We can have hallucinations. There's mirages. There's illusions. There's all kinds of ways that our senses can go wrong, but we're nevertheless justified in believing the external world. The fact that they can go wrong doesn't completely undermine our rational belief in the external world. So we can be mistaken when we apply this principle that our senses are giving us true information about an external world. We can also be mistaken when we apply the uniformity of nature. And this usually comes by way, whenever you're making an inductive argument, you're arguing from things that have been observed to things that have not been observed. You're extrapolating from the past to the future, from the observed to the unobserved. And whenever you're extrapolating like that, you're making an inductive case. And inductive cases never give you certainty. So it's always possible that you could be wrong. And we often are wrong. We make hasty generalizations. That's where your sample size was too small, or that there's some difference that you didn't account for, or just, the fact that anomalies happen. So just as those two things, when you apply them, you can be wrong, it's the same thing as the case with morality. Sometimes we come to wrong moral conclusions, and this is just evident in the fact that people sometimes disagree about morality, or the fact that we change our mind about a moral point of view. I'm going to talk more about that when I do the video on arguments against morality, because that's one of the arguments people make against morality sometimes, is the fact that, well, if morality is this objective thing, why do people have disagreements about it? Well, all that disagreement shows is that it's possible to be wrong about our moral conclusions. But the mere possibility of being wrong doesn't show that there are no right answers. I mean, we can be wrong about the external world too, but that doesn't mean that there is no external world. So that's another one. The other one is that, and I guess I've already made this point, is that whether you affirm the reality of moral principles or not, everybody at least perceives them as if they were real. They at least seem prima facie real. And most people will just assume they're real until philosophy talks them out of it. I mean, we're just kind of born. Even little kids will make justifications for their action. They feel the weight of their own guilt. And this is an interesting thing because although you do have to teach a kid right from wrong, you don't have to teach them the whole concept of moral justification. They automatically know that. The information is just kind of hardwired. So they do something that their parent told them not to do, and they get caught, and so they'll start making excuses. Well, they'll say something like, I realize I wasn't supposed to do that. However, in this case, I couldn't help it because such and such reason. They'll make an excuse. And so this betrays an awareness that they have that there are certain ways, there are certain reasons that give a moral justification for something. There was a guy named Hadley Arkes who wrote this book called First Things. And he argued in that book that morality, all of morality, is kind of based on this idea of giving reasons or justifications for your actions. And that's something that's just hardwired into kids. As long as they're old enough to speak, they can give excuses and reasons and stuff. And so what all those previous things that I was talking about indicate is that whether you affirm the reality of morality or not, you're still going to perceive it as if it was real, and it's going to be counterintuitive. Well, the same thing is true of the external world. Even people who are idealists still perceive the external world as if it were real. And I've heard a lot of people on the internet say things like, we can't know for certain that the external world is real. Nevertheless, we can't escape the illusion of it. We still get hurt, when we fall or when things happen to us. So they've just decided for pragmatic reasons to live as if it were real. Well, it seems to me that this betrays the fact that even if they deny its reality or express doubts about its reality, it still appears real to them. It seems as if it were real. And the same thing is true. I don't know if there are any people that deny the uniformity of, oh yeah, there are. I actually had a debate with somebody who denied the uniformity of nature. He denied inductive reasoning altogether. He was, of course, inconsistent in that belief, but there are people that deny it. But almost all of us learn from experience. Even dogs. The whole Pavlov's dog experiment is based on the idea that dogs can learn from experience. They hear a bell, they get the food. They hear the bell, they get the food. Eventually, every time they hear the bell, they expect the food. They've learned that that's going to happen. Well, of course, they can still be mistaken about that too, as I said. So anyway, another thing is that this is something that it's prima facie unreasonable to deny. And this is true with both the external world, the uniformity of nature, and morality. It's prima facie unreasonable to deny it. And I've already gone into the reasons for that, I think. And the final thing that all of these things have in common is that we use them in our daily lives. Like I said, our daily lives, we're obviously interacting with the external world around us. We're also continuously learning from experience, or we're acting on information that we learned from the past. Why do you go to the refrigerator to get your food? Well, it's because you've been there before, you know where it is, there's going to be food in there. All your interactions with people are based on your past experience with them. The people you expect certain things from them. You trust people or you distrust them based on past experience. So the same thing is true with morality. It may not necessarily seem that you're using morality continuously in your day-to-day life, but that's because we do it automatically. It's the only time we notice that we're thinking carefully about morality is when we've come up against a difficult moral decision that we have to make. Wow, we've like 35 minutes. This has already turned out to be the longest video. It's a good thing I'm close to the end. But anyway, we use morality in our daily lives. Like, say you're walking behind somebody and they drop their wallet. Well, your automatic reaction is to pick up the wallet and give it back to them. Sir, you dropped your wallet. That kind of thing. We're continuously, day to day, whenever we're interacting with people, we are applying built-in moral principles that we have. It's something that happens in our daily lives. So there you have it. That's my argument. Morality, this third category of a priori knowledge has all these things in common, and those things they have in common are the reason they belong in this third category of knowledge. Well, morality has all those same characteristics. And so if we're rational in believing all these things in this third category, then we're just as rationally in believing morality. Morality rests on the same epistemological foundation as our belief in the external world, other minds, the past, the uniformity of nature, causation, all these other synthetic a priori items of knowledge. Morality is on the same epistemological footing. So if we're rational in believing those things based on this intuition that we have, then we're equally rational in believing in morality. And if it's unreasonable to deny these things, then it's equally unreasonable to deny morality. And that's my argument for morality. After all that, I still forgot to tell you something that I wanted to tell you. I just wanted to say that for me, it all boils down to just being totally honest with myself. When you're like a teenager or in your young 20s, it's pretty typical to get together with your friends, maybe even over a doobie, and start talking about all the possibilities for how reality could be different than it appears to be. Maybe this is like maybe we're a parasite inside a giant goat's stomach, or all these crazy things about you entertain all these possibilities. And I did this too. I did this, throughout my childhood. But I remember there was a point at which I decided I needed to just start being totally honest with myself about what I actually believe. I mean, philosophy is fun, but and so it's fun to speculate about things and come up with crazy ideas and stuff. But I also want to believe what's true and stuff. And so I decided I needed to just be totally honest with myself about what I actually believe. And in spite of, I think I mentioned in one of my videos on epistemology that I used to toy with this idea that of solipsism, and I used to toy with idealism and the idea that maybe I was just in a dream and none of this was real and stuff like that. And I wrestled with that a lot as a kid. But when I got older, I just started thinking I need to just be honest with myself. And when I'm totally honest with myself, and this requires a bit of introspection, I don't actually doubt that the external world exists. In spite of the fact that there's no way for me to ever prove it, I don't honestly doubt it. And the same thing is true of morality. In spite of all the arguments I've heard against it and all the debates I've heard, I haven't heard anything that has moved me in the slightest to doubt the existence of morality. It seems just as obvious to me as every other member of a priori knowledge that I have. Especially, it's especially obvious. It may not be obvious when you're thinking about difficult moral issues, and it seems like, well, it's hard to tell which one's right. Maybe there's no right answer at all. But there are other examples that are just clear case examples of rights or wrongs and stuff. And when you think about really egregious moral wrongs, it's very hard to look at those and think about them and honestly say, it's not really wrong. It's all in my head. I can't do that. And so I encourage you to, at some point, set aside the philosophy and stuff and do some introspection and be totally honest with yourself about what you actually believe. And once you figure out what you believe, stop pretending to believe otherwise. That's my advice.